I'm Ray White. I'm chair of the Department of History here at Ball State University. And I welcome you to the department's lecture series in commemoration of the university's 75th anniversary. This is just one aspect of the celebration that's going on this year. And this lecture is the first in a series of 5 presentations that will be given this year, sponsored by the History Department. And the next presentation will be October the 27th, in which Emeriti Professor Dwight Hoover will be reflecting upon his impressions of Ball State University in the period from 1959 to 1991. And then in the spring there will be 3 additional presentations that are still in the planning stage at this point. I want to thank the History Department committee that is chaired by Professor John Kumilides, who's sitting there in the back, for developing and planning this series. And other members of that committee include Emeriti Professor Phyllis Uhas, Professor Tony Edmonds, Professor Bruce Gilhold, and Professor Kevin Smith. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Phil Ball, whom many of you know. Before I continue with this presentation, I want to recognize his new book, some of which some of you may already have a copy of this. It's the unauthorized biography of a local doctor. And as you know, Dr. Ball is noted for his pungent and pointed points of view. And you won't be disappointed in this book. And I recommend you get a copy of it. And this Saturday at 2 o'clock, he will be at the bookshop in Lindenbrook. 12 to 2, excuse me. Thank you for correcting me. And you can get a copy, and he will gladly autograph it for you. I can't imagine a better person to initiate this series than Dr. Ball. He's a product of Ball State, as is his wife, Esther, and he has lived and worked in the shadow of Ball State all of his life. And it's especially significant that Dr. Ball this year, like the university, is celebrating his 75th anniversary. Indeed, he grew up with Ball State, and he knows its people, its buildings, its streets, and its academic mannerisms. And he knows them in a way that few people do. So over the years, as a citizen, an author, and a physician of Muncie and Middletown and Normal City, he's watched the college and the university grow. And in that process, he's become something of an institution himself. And we have a delightful and a rare opportunity tonight to hear one institution comment upon the history of another institution and the community in which it sits. And so, Phil, welcome this evening. Delighted that you're here.
If I get this damn thing on. Now can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Can everybody see the top of this screen too? If you can't move, there are some seats up front. There are some seats up front. Be glad to have you down here. Nobody will pick on you or call on you. As Ray said, that this book that I wrote recently, I didn't intend it as a brag or vanity book. I wanted to tell a story about the 75 years of life of an average or generic or typical citizen of this plain Middle Western town, and the story of how that town has changed in 75 years. Except for a few years away in training and some for a long ago war, I've been here almost 3/4 of a century, almost all of that. Or if you use the Pope's in utero concept, it really is over 75 years. I believe I can speak with some validity about this place of Middletown. In researching and putting my book together, it became apparent to me that my town and my roots were being altered so that much of the past was being lost, in my opinion. Hence this polemic, and that's what this is. This is a polemic, Ray. The title, I call it, is Lost Muncie. Or subtitle, Mr. Willard, won't you please come home? I'll try to address several questions in this talk. Is there a concerted plan to cause chaotic obsolescence and demolition of Old Muncie? Will Old Muncie be lost completely? Is there a plot to destroy my roots, my own personal roots? By whom? Why? Have I offended more people than I know about? Can we not save a small ceremonial, statuarial segment of Old Muncie in a pantheon for our town? And finally, Mr. Willard, won't you please come home? Those are the questions I'll try to address. Now, this town of mine has gone through several historical phases. Beginning about 15,000 years ago, so they say, there were the Paleo and Archaic Indians, and later the Hopewell and Adena mounds building Indians, and then the Woodland Indians, that's the Miamis and Delawares, and then the age of the white explorers, the traders and trappers, the voyageurs, the coureurs du bois, some Spanish, some English, a lot of French. And then the age of the pioneer settlers, that began in 1823 with old Goldsmith C. Gilbert. And these people were mostly English, Scotch, and Irish, and German. And they started the one family farm, and the land here began to change then for the first time. Then we had the gas boom, 1886, 1887, and so on. That caused big changes. Then we've had the Rust Belt since about 1950, and things started going down the tube then. Then we have our culture of today. You can call this the culture of fast food and TV and instant junk and Walmart and McDonald's and microwave food and plastic throwaway dishes and pink Zinfandel wine. You know, you can't get well without Zinfandel, they say that. And then light beer, and that's spelled L-I-T-E, and pickup trucks and minivans and obscene bumper stickers, the sirloin stockade, or is it stockyard, I forget which, tank tops, Mountain Dew, Beavis and Butthead on MTV, Madonna and Michael doing crotch grab dances, pocket handguns are more common than pocket combs, and there are more religious zealots around than there are political zealots anymore. We have morning talk shows where the hosts feature panel arguments among participants in a group sex club composed of cross-eyed transvestites. What do you call this culture today? Well, I call it the age of instant electronic crotch junk. That's about as close as I can get to it. Let me backtrack in time a little bit and give you a glimpse of what Muncie and Delaware County were like, say, in 1823 when Goldsmith C. Gilbert arrived here to stay. Here, I'm going to read you a piece of fulsome verbiage that was written in 1940 by Ross Lockridge Sr., professor of history at IU. He was talking about the primeval Delaware County. Let me quote you a little bit from that. He said in 1940, Delaware County is an area, well, he said in its first mapping, Delaware County blended naturally with the primitive hardwood area of which it was a central unit. The surface being gently rolling, the circle of the horizon, when viewed from any point of its mild elevations, presented an unbroken rim at all points of the compass. Boy, this is good writing. The sky was met by the blended tops of the forest that stood on a comparatively level floor. Local views within the timber walls were open to short vistas where groups of big trees shut off the sunlight above and choked out the undergrowth, leaving mosses and short-stemmed annuals to brighten the shaded floors. There were wide, dense arbors where the upgrowth of coming trees struggled through a mesh of clinging vines. Intervening space was filled with hedgy spices, and sun-flocked windfalls were lined with clusters of berries. In contrast with these would occur the pool and swamp, where the wild landscape opened suddenly to the sun and aquatic life prevailed. Does that sound like Delaware County? I guess so. John, would you give us that First slide there, and we'll show you what some of this looked like. And Ross Lockridge went on to say the forest wall ended abruptly at the water line, and here was presented a sylvan panorama of overhanging foliage sparkling in the sunlight. Well, anyway, here's a scene in Delaware County. That's spring, and you can see some violets in the foreground and some spring beauties all over the lot there. Give me another slide, John, if you will. And this is Delaware County. This is in the summertime. Beautiful big trees. There's an oak, and you can see a shagbark hickory. And the next one, please. And you'll look up, if you looked up, if you're looking up a shagbark hickory trunk, you don't see much. You just see leaves. You don't see much of the sky. And the next one, please. And there's a fall scene in the Delaware County woods. And then later, another slide, John. That's a winter scene in Delaware County, except this wasn't 1823 because you see some tire tracks over there. Well, anyway, that's what Ross Lockridge said it was like, and that's what Goldsmith C. Gilbert saw. It was a natural wilderness. The pioneers in the gas boom changed that completely. Now, I grew up in this town when it was just 30 years or so away from its gas boom transformation. Its transformation and splendor of that time. Just 30 years later, I came along. And as I researched the data for my biography, my book, it became painfully obvious that much of this beautiful old Muncie that they'd built up in the gas boom in my youth, it was disappearing because of a variety of forces. Let me quote you a couple of pages from my book. We old-timers in Muncie have a problem when we try to tell some younger person, we could have the lights back on maybe, about how to find some specific building or business or address in Muncie. For instance, we try to pinpoint for someone the location of Muncie's downtown bus station. We may say, well, it's there between Main Street and Jackson Street where the Western Reserve Life Insurance Building used to be, and our place, and Johnson's Hardware, and the Alcazar Bar. If we want to tell someone where the Ball Foundation has its offices, we say, well, it's where the Rivoli Theater was once upon a time. Or we say, the Ball Foundation location is across Adams Street from the old Muncie Star Building. However, you must be told that the Muncie Star Building later housed Jack's Camera Shop and Delaney's Dress Shop in the Western Union, and then they tore it down. And Jack's Camera Shop's now over on Main Street in the Commercial Club Building. Before Jack's moved into that spot, the Commercial Club Building was the site of the office of the Central Indiana Gas Company. The gas company built a new building on Jackson Street where the Delaware Hotel used to be before they tore it down. And then the gas company was swallowed up by another outfit from Indianapolis, and it disappeared. Meanwhile, the Commercial Club changed into the Chamber of Commerce and moved for a while into a brick phone booth-sized building on Walnut and Weiser, and later it went to the Muncie Federal Building, and where the Muncie Federal Building and the post office used to be. On the other hand, the Federal Building was changed by Jim Gooden into the Rising Center. There is no Federal Building now as far as I know, and the post office moved to a vacant lot on 12th Street by a railroad track. I find myself getting a little tense just talking about these things. Maybe someone will ask one of us old-timers where the Tourist Bureau is, and we'll say, well, it's in the High Street Square building. That's where Orv's Drive-In used to be. Before that, the Barefoot Poultry business was there, and before that, there used to be a flour mill on that site that used White River water running down an artificial mill race canal to water power its mill. They filled in the mill race and called it Race Street, and it's still there, dead ending at the Central High School property. And we old-timers try to tell some young residents something about the passing of the buffalo. We say, well, that's that beautiful bronze statue by Cyrus Darlene that Ed Petty bought and placed in the middle of Walnut Street right in front of all stores, which used to be called the McNaughton Department Store and was just south of a stretch of Walnut Street that had Stillman's store and the Johnson Block. Unfortunately, these buildings are all gone, so we really should say the passing of the buffalo is a statue in the middle of Walnut Street near Charles Street across from a vacant lot. Come to think about it, we should maybe have someone put up a statue called the Passing of the Department Store, or maybe the Passing of Downtown Muncie. If some young person says, where was the interurban station for the electric trains that went between cities in the old days? We say, you mean the Union Traction Terminal in Muncie, the second biggest electric railway terminal in the country? Well, it's where the J.C. Penney store was after it moved from where People's Studio used to be to where the Charles Court is now before Penney's moved into that ugly and confusing 3-mile shopping strip at a place called the Muncie Mall. The interurbans quit running and disappeared, and Ziegler's, now Dobro, bought up the tracks for scrap, and the terminal was torn down. The Children's Museum moved from where the Y store was before it burned down to where Walgreens Drugstore and the Columbia Theater used to be. And in 1994, the Children's Museum will move into a building where Federal Park used to be. Now, Federal Park wasn't a park, it was a bird roost and a guano depository and a place for panhandlers to hang out in the days gone by. And then if you look for the site of the old Central High School, it's where the Ball Corporation headquarters is now. The old Ball Brothers office on Macedonia is now the Ball Incon office, I think. And I've already told you that the new Central High School is the dead end of Race Street. The old Ball Brothers glass factory in Muncie has completely disappeared. In fact, no glass has been made in Muncie for 30 years or so, except for an occasional glass expression by people trying to figure out which way this talk is going. Also gone are Acme Lees and Owens, Illinois, and Warner Machine and Glasscox and Durham and Marhofer and all those. The old Goddard's wholesale grocers building burned, but they were no longer a wholesale grocer anyway. Babe's truck stop burned down. It was reputed to be a house of great fame, but they got the girls out just before it burned. Babe is dead. I don't know where the girls went. The Muncie Public Library is still on Jackson Street, catty corner from the old City Hall, but the new City Hall is now on High Street where the Muncie electric power generators used to be. But now our power comes in on wires from coal generator plants and atomic and wind generators, and even from hot air generators in Washington, for all I know. The old Ontario silver plate factory over by the West Jackson Bridge became the Ontario Corporation and switched from making silverware to making jet rotor blades. Ontario later moved into offices on Adams Street, where the Industrial Trust and Savings Bank used to be. The old Ontario factory near the bridge became Arrow Forge. They may be making silverware again there for all I know. The Industrial Trust and Savings Bank became Summit Bank after it was bought by some out-of-town people, and then it was sold again and has yet another name today that I can't remember. Does this sound like early Alzheimer's? Well, maybe it is, but I don't care. These are just some of the problems that we old-timers have, and we try to tell something where some building or some business is in downtown Muncie. I don't blame young people for getting confused. I'm that way myself sometimes. Now, John, let me see some of these other slides we've got here. We've got one blank, not another one. Some lights down, please. This is the old Star building that's across where the Muncie Star was in the ground floor, and the second and third floors used to be hospital. In fact, my dad worked there as a sort of an intern, so he says. Anyway, they tore it down. That's a parking lot. Next one, please. And that's another view of the Star building when it had the Western Union in the basement, in the ground floor. Next one, please. And there's the passing of the Buffalo down Walnut Street. And the next slide will show you the vacant lot that used to be Ball Stores. Next slide, please. And that's the traction terminal. Beautiful old building. Those traction things really worked. You got to Indianapolis in about an hour and a half. Right downtown at Crossing Block Store. Next one, please. And that's looking from the sidewalk at the Ball Foundation office, looking across to the vacant lot where the Star building used to be, and you're looking at where Penny's used to be, but before that the traction terminal used to be where that building is in the background. So anyway, next slide please. Everything used to be someplace. That used to be, I think, the Y store. It used to be the Children's Museum, but it's gone. Next slide. And this used to be the Johnson building, but now it's a parking lot, and that's where the Columbia Theater used to be, and that used to be Goddard's building. And they're tearing it down. Everybody's tearing things down. Let's see the next one now, please. And this used to be a bank building, and then it was the audio visual, and my dad started his practice on the second floor of that building. But it's gone now. Next one, please. There's the old train station. Keep rolling through these rapidly now. And it was a beautiful old building. It's gone. The old Big Four station. Next slide, please. And that used to be, that was one of Muncie's first tourist cabins. Doesn't look like much there, does it? That was Wirt's Tourist City out on West 32, yeah. That beautiful building, it's gone. That was a second-story switch house. I love that place, but it's gone. They take everything down that I love. There's a Hotel Muncie, day and night. They had day rates. I think they had hourly rates, too. I don't know. There were a lot of people that slept just an hour in those days, and they were perfectly willing to pay for an hour. It's gone. This building is where Kirk's used to be. That building's still there, I think, but I'm not sure. Who knows anymore? It's gone. That used to be the Masonic Temple there on the left, that building on the left, Muncie's first Masonic Temple. Next one, keep going. That's Patterson Building. It's still around. Keep going. That's used to be Fencel's Liquors on the ground floor. I wouldn't know that except somebody told me that. Next one, please. That's in back of the Hotel Roberts. Next slide, please. I don't know whether that's here or not. It's for lease anyway. Next slide, please. That building, I think, is still around. It's on High Street. Next one, please. Well, I can't tell whether these things are around anyway or not, but are we going to lose all these artifacts of our past? Are we going to lose the knowledge and the memory and the buildings and the monuments and the story of the heroes of our local past? You know, I believe in that the years 1823 to 1910 or so, there was tremendous energy and vitality and originality loose in this town. And our predecessors built for us a pretty neat, pretty and comfortable town. We had Goldsmith C. Gilbert, we mentioned him, who almost single-handedly made Muncie a town. We had the Willards and the Meeks and the McCulloughs and the Nottinghams and the Kimbroughs and the Johnsons and the Weisers and the Maxons and the Goddards and the Buffalo Balls. And these were all giants of energy, and they left monuments of factories and downtown buildings and huge homes and streets named for them and subdivisions. And they started many organizations still in place today. Let me give you a thumbnail profile of just one of these, George Folk McCullough. He was born in 1855 in Ohio, came to Muncie as an infant. His first job was grocery delivery boy. And then he was a clerk in various stores. They said he was the best penman in the county. And in those days, that was important. Typing was nothing back when he was starting in business. Penmanship was important. Best penman in the county. He was a lawyer, a politician. They said he was a live wire. He founded the Citizens Enterprise Corporation. That's the predecessor of the Chamber of Commerce. He started the Muncie Street Railway System. He was one of the founders of Union Traction that covered the state. He was one of the founders of the Muncie Star, the Indianapolis Star, and the Terre Haute Star. He started the Whiteley Land Company that sold land in Whiteley. He started the Indiana Bridge Company. He started the Gas Company. He donated all of the land and the buildings, that is the church, the rectory, and the parish house for the Grace Episcopal Church. That was George Folk McCullough. And he gave the park that bears his name, McCullough Park, in 1901. Let's turn the lights off and see that picture. There's George Folk McCullough out there in McCullough Park today. Muncie's downtown, when first created, included some distinguished stores, office buildings, government buildings, beautiful churches, and fine close-in homes. Several things happened to sap the downtown. The car was one of them. The downtown never has caught up with the need for free parking. And then the repolarization of the nicest residential area from close in on the east side, that is East Washington, East Main, East Jackson, East Adams, to the west side. This was the fault of the normal school out here. It reversed the polarity of the best residential area. And this left these previous best neighborhoods to be near slums. They've tried to revive the East Central, but so far it hasn't worked too well. And gradually stores and shops and offices began to leave the downtown. Banks opened up branches out in the boonies in the edges of Muncie, and this was really a death blow to the downtown, because before that, almost every business and every professional person went downtown to bank every day. But after the branches opened, they didn't do that anymore. The downtown also was afflicted with a succession of problems: absentee ownership, lack of parking, lack of planning, pigeons, starlings, fears of histoplasmosis, fires of uncertain origin, bulldozers, neglect, leaky roofs, leaky steam heat pipes, and above all these newly zoned, ugly new shopping malls on the fringes. And as I looked into this story of change in Muncie, I also began to look back over my own experiences, my own feelings, my own background, my own roots, and some of the buildings that had to do with me. Now, I was born in the Old Home Hospital. Can I have there's the Old Home Hospital. They were tearing it down when I got this picture on South Jefferson Street in Muncie. This building was built, I think, in 1919, and it was demolished in the 1950s. So that's where I was born. So they tore it down. And the first home in which I lived from birth to the age of 6, an upstairs flat over my dad's office at 303 West Adams Street, was torn down in the 1970s. This was after it had been owned by the Methodist Church for a few years, I think. It didn't look so good by that time. Next slide, please. And they had various offices in there. I think Action was in there for a while. Next slide, please. That house inside had some beautiful German tile work around the mantels and around the fireplaces. Next slide, please. Beautiful German tile work. Then the school that I attended in kindergarten and first grade, the next slide, please, Jefferson School. Well, that's the way that 303 West Adams Street looks now. It's a parking lot. Everything turns into a parking lot. That's a parking lot for Ball Corporation. And Jefferson School, where I went to in kindergarten and first grade, was torn down in the 1970s. It also was rented by Action Incorporated for a while, but that empty lot was Jefferson School. And the school that I attended from second grade through junior high school, next slide please, was Emerson. That's all that's left of Emerson, the steps. Next slide please. The steps, and then the next slide shows they built it in 1922 and tore it down in the 1980s. The high school I attended, the old red brick Central High School in downtown Muncie, was demolished in the 1960s. Every time I look around for one of these places that I knew as a kid, they were tearing it down. So there's Central High School going down. Next slide, please. More of Central High School going down. Next slide, please. More of Central High School going down. And the old original 1929 Ball Memorial Hospital building, they demolished it in 1967. There they are bulldozing it. And with it went a lot of memories that I had of my medical past. In fact, the room where I recovered from an appendectomy. And the rest of this building has been buried under a building of dubious style. You can't even find that building anymore, but some of it's still there. The so-called E.B. Ball Medical Building, where I spent decades curing medical problems of the citizenry, has been converted to a funny farm. I don't have a picture of that. It's too painful. So even, next slide. Even that's the north wing of the Ball Memorial Hospital going down. Even the cemetery where my ancestors were buried south of town has been allowed to grow up. Yeah, that's the cemetery in the middle. You can see a little iron fence around it. And next slide, please, I think. And the trees are growing up and it's neglected. So even the cemetery where some of my ancestors are has been neglected and overgrown. You see what I mean by worrying that some force was loose trying to destroy my roots as well as Muncie. And as progressive change went on in the area of downtown Muncie, my family joined the exodus to one of the outlying areas. In 1925, we emigrated from 303 West Adams Street to a place out in Neely Addition, almost beyond the fringe of civilization of the known world. We moved to a big colonial house. That's another cemetery there. Next one, that isn't the colonial house. That's the colonial house. At 1015 Linden. It's now 1000 Wayne Street. And the same house that they called, we called it 1015 Linden, they call it 1000 Wayne Street now. And as early this summer, that's the way it still looked. But it's already been changed. They're changing it into a bed and breakfast. Next slide, please. There's some of the students passing by, I guess. I don't know. Anyway. In the years of the 1920s to 1950s, this house looked out on, so it seemed to me, an endless savanna of grass. All the way from Minnetrista Boulevard at Wheeling Avenue, clear to the present New York Avenue. An endless, interminable pasture for Mr. Chappell's cows. That's the way it looked when we first moved out there. And some other pictures of the pasture and Mr. Chappell's cows. Some other pictures, please, of Mr. Chappell's cows. And then one final one. This one posed for me there. So you see, that's the way it looked. And but if you look now for that same pasture, next slide, this is the way it looks. It's the corner of Wayne and Linden. The house that I lived in is up on the hill over here, and there's the cardinal corner. So it's been a big change. And on the west end of this huge savanna of grass, there used to be a woods, we called it Schick's Woods, and a gravel pit we called Schick's Pond. And that's where Schick's Woods and Schick's Ponds were now, one of the dormitories on New York Avenue. Anybody know the name of that one? Studebaker. That's Schick's to me. Even Normal City, that charmed village around the normal school, underwent change by bulldozers and fungus and degradation. I started my practice in Normal City many decades ago in a house that was remodeled to be my office on West Jackson Street. Can we have the next slide, please? This office was right where this parking lot is. Everything is where a parking lot is now. Now, the building that the office was in on West Jackson Street has actually been moved one block back And you see the back end of it now because it faces on Main Street. It's that little gray building in the middle. So anyway, they didn't destroy the building, but they moved it a block and turned the office area into a parking lot. I still think that there's some kind of anonymous unknown persons that are trying to erase all my roots. And they've almost totally erased Normal City. There's only one structure. There used to be Normal City Cleaners, Normal City Coal Yard, Normal City this, Normal City that, Normal City Pharmacy. There's only one place left that bears the name Normal City. Can we have the next one, please? And there it is, the Normal City United Methodist Church. And if we didn't have people guarding this, they would be they would be destroying it too, you see. We have these volunteer guards who protect some of these things. In the 1970s, I was really depressed about Muncie's stagnant, dilapidated, decaying state with bulldozers running around every place. And my poetry reflected it. For instance, I wrote one little poem. Is the sun going down in Middletown? Are we living on in a fading rust belt place, each of us turning our face away so we don't see the sun going down on our Middletown? Sort of depressing, isn't it? To have a safe haven from the bulldozers demolishing old Muncie, almost 25 years ago, Esther and I bought a piece of farmland with some old buildings on it out on Nebo Road. 4 miles of farmland out in the country. In that 25 years, that 4-mile buffer zone is almost filled up with instant junk, microwave, MTV, advancing civilization. This little piece of farmland of ours was the site of an old one-room brick county school, the Mount Olive School. Can we have the next slide there, John, please? One more. There's the Mount Olive School. Built in 1887 and abandoned to neglect and decay in 1919. And next slide, please. And these were must have been the last class there in 1919. I think there's one teacher over on the extreme left and the rest are all students. You can see the outside toilet in the background on the right. They probably had one for both boys and girls. I think that was proper. Notice they had 2 doors. I don't know whether the doors were boys and girls. I really don't know. But that's the Mount Olive School. This little school was neglected. And next slide, please. And the roof fell in by the time we bought it. The roof had fallen in and the walls are falling down, and that's all that's left of it, that little piece of brick wall. But we love that little piece of brick wall. Next slide, please. And of course, we have to station people. Here's one of my brothers guarding this wall. That's all that's left of it, because we don't know who's going to come in and bulldoze it. Bulldozers are loose everywhere. And we did the old barn over on this property and put it together. Can we have the next slide, John? That's the old barn on the property. And then next slide, John. You can see it was pretty dilapidated. Next slide, please. And Esther helped prop it up. Next slide, please. She got it straight, and she held it there until we could get some carpenters in to put some other boards in there. Next slide, please. And then this is the grain bin, and she got some props on it. It was about to fall down. Next slide, please. And she got it stabilized anyway. Next slide, please. Got it stabilized. Next slide. And she's pounding some stakes in there to hold these supports. Next slide, please. And so it's looking better now. This grain bin has been attached to the house. Next slide, please. And finally, it's our house, you see. So it worked. Next carousel, John, if you will. There was an old barn on this property too. Another old barn. You have to turn to 0 there. Quite a problem. Takes 2 historians to handle this. Wonderful. And then you got to turn that to 0 too. They're half blind because they're working in the dark. Advance to the next slide, John, if you will. There was an old barn on this property, and we worked on it too. Next slide, please. And we got it fixed up, and we even put a scarecrow. Next slide. And we landscaped it, and there's some, that's not on fire, that's the evening sun reflected off the glass, but it's a beautiful barn. Next slide, please. We saved it. Next slide, please. And it looks like this. It's a beautiful place. But we have to guard it. Next slide. And if we didn't guard it, there'd be somebody come in and bulldoze it. We know that. We saved the old WPA farm outhouse, too, from the 1930s. Can I have the next slide, please? There's the old outhouse in the woods. Now, this actually was built in the 30s according to WPA criteria. And in fact, the old farmers called it the Federal Building. They say, "Mom," the farmer would say, "Mom, I'm going out to the Federal Building to take care of some business." Or they called it the Roosevelt, too. "Mom, I'm going out to the Roosevelt for a while." And it was much used. Next slide. You see, this is a busy place, this old outhouse. One going in, one coming out. And next slide, please. But we have to guard it. Here's my daughter with a pitchfork guarding it. We'd run out of guns by that time. And then we did redo this one. Next slide, please. We faced it with brick, and there's Esther going into it. You see it? You've heard the phrase, built like a brick outhouse. Well, there it is. Lights on, please. There are lots of halls of fame scattered around this country. There's a baseball hall of fame in Cooperstown, New York, and a football hall of fame somewhere over in Ohio. Maybe you know where it is. I don't know where it is. And a tennis hall of fame in New England. And Newcastle has some kind of a hall of fame that was dedicated by Vice President Dan Quayle. Maybe it's the Potato Hall of Fame. I don't know. These are all places where statues and memorabilia are collected, and scrolls and plaques and pictures and so on. And many cities have a public park or a plaza or a mall where historic trophies are exhibited. Indianapolis has its Circle and its Pan American Plaza. And New York has its Times Square. And Muncie has a start of such a place. But we need to enhance and dramatize and feature and expand its attractions. Muncie's repository of memorabilia is Weiser Park. What, you say, Weiser Park? Where in the hell is that? Well, it's the 100 block of West Main Street, across Main Street from the Delaware County Building. And it presently includes the remains of the entranceway of the old Weiser Building and some statuary. Let me tell you a little of the history of those three statues. Can we have a slide there, John? Those three statues that are in Weiser Park as of the present. There's Weiser Park, and that's the doorway of the old Weiser Building. You can see the three statues over there on the left. These three statues stood on the roof of the old courthouse building for 80 years until it was demolished. In 1885, the county fathers paid $1,600 for these three historical gems. One of the statues is of a standing Indian brave officially entitled Delaware Chief. Have the next slide, please. Next one, please. That's the Weiser Building. You see the doorway down on the lower right there. That's the arch that remains. Beautiful building, but it gave way to pigeons, guano, and maybe a fire. I think there was a fire finally. Can we have that off now? And you see these arches, they're really by the Europeans. Now, this is an Italian painting that was on sale at Sotheby's recently, worth a ton of money. They wouldn't even tell you what it was worth. They said estimate on request. So they're crazy about arches like that. But in this town, our Weiser arch isn't thought to mean much. There's the old courthouse. The statues of the women are on the third story on this face, and the Indians up here on the roof on this face. Next one, please. Beautiful building, isn't it? There's that beautiful building again. Next slide, please. That's what's left today. It looks like the basement is all that's left there. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, there's the women up there on the third story on the Main Street side. Industry with the gear in her hand, and agriculture over here has got some sheaves of wheat and corn. And you notice the left arm's broken off on this woman. Next slide, please. They brought those statues down. There's Dick Green. The statue's splattered with some starling manure, and I'm afraid Dick is too. And you notice the arm's broken off. That's industry there. Next slide, please. There's the Indian. Man, is he misshapen. I mean, look at the proportions of that guy. And the dog looks like a gargoyle. And they say that dog was originally modeled after a dog that was owned by the tavern operator on the Walnut Street side of the courthouse square. And so the story goes, originally, this dog had one leg raised on the Indian's leg in the act of relieving himself. And they forced a change. They said they couldn't have that up there. So they put some other piece of stuff in there to cover it up, and you can't see it anymore. Anyway, that's the Indian. Now can we have the next one, please? And there's industry again, a beautiful woman. And these statues of industry and agriculture were carved by my wife's grandfather, Jack Ward, who came from North Ireland. And so they're nice-looking women, nice proportioned women. There's agriculture. She's got the corn and maybe the wheat and so on. If that's wheat, that's awful big wheat she's holding in her left hand. But they're beautiful. Next slide, please. That's all right. We'll leave right there. So we've got a repository for memorabilia then, with these three statues already there in that arch. And in fact, you know, when these statues were brought down to the ground in 1965 so that the present Delaware County building could be put up, these statues were lowered to the ground and put together in a plywood shack that was erected on the courthouse square near the corner of Main Street and Walnut Street. These three statues were in that shack together, two white women and a male Indian brave with his dog, for some 2 years during the time that new building was going up. Many people worried about what might happen to the women inside that shack. Some persons proposed that a window be cut in the shack to permit some chaperoning to be done. And some advised that a supply of birth control devices be placed inside the shack, but they could never agree on what kind of devices. Condoms were favored, but experts said that the heat in the shack in the summer would ruin them. Others recommended that a heavy timber partition be placed between the Indian and the women. The Humane Society got very upset about it because they said it was okay to have people in the shack, but you couldn't have a dog shut up in there. When the shack was opened after the construction site had been cleared, it was found that the statues had all survived okay. There was no evidence that the dog had suffered, the women had been assaulted, or sexually harassed. These statues were loaded up and carried out of town to the Stradling farm on Wheeling, and they remained out there for several years, and then they were brought back to a warehouse until James Patrick Carey and Professor Anthony Costello conceived this idea of Weiser Park, and then they were put up there. So we got this place, Weiser Park, that we could assemble some historic artifacts to protect them, and I believe we should try to assemble some memorabilia in this park. For starters, what about bringing Mr. McCullough to Weiser Park? He's been out there in McCullough Park. Who sees him? When have you seen him last? Anybody seen that statue recently? I had to go out there and take a picture of it about a month ago. I hadn't seen it in years. And he was this early tycoon I was telling you about. And then the next one, there's another statue. Oh, there's Mr. McCullough again. Fine-looking gentleman, all bronze. There's a statue, that's at Ball Memorial Hospital. It's in the center court. I don't know where this came from, but John Kumalita says he thinks it's Hygeia, the health goddess, Greek health goddess. She's holding this cup. I don't know what's in it. Maybe it's a urine specimen. Can we have the next slide, please? There she is again. She's partially naked, as you can see, and so they've pretty well got a bunch of trees and bushes growing up around her now so that nobody's out incensed by it. And then we've got, we could have another statue I think should be brought there is Mr. Willard. Now Mr. Willard is up there on the third story at the corner in that niche. You see the word Willard underneath there, and that's an heroic bronze statue, larger than life, that's probably 10 feet tall. And who was Mr. Willard? Well, this is Mr. Charles Willard Sr., Charles F. Willard Sr. And guess what he did? He was a dealer in furs and ginseng and other products in Muncie in the middle 1800s. No kidding. Ginseng was being found in the woods around here and sold mostly to the Chinese trade. And it was very valuable product. So he dealt in furs and ginseng and made a ton of money. And some of his descendants put up this building and put his statue up there. And he stood up there in his Prince Albert coat with a very stern expression facing southwest, and he always had about 3 inches of bird dew on his head and shoulders. May have been the bird dew that gave him the serious expression. He stood in that niche in heat and cold until about 1966, and by that time the Federal Savings and Loan, which was in the ground floor, was kicked out by the American National Bank, which is right next door. And because the American National Bank wanted to put in a drive-in and a mini park right there, so they did, and the Federal Savings and Loan went down on High Street across from the high school, and then the American National Bank pursued them even there and bought them, and they've since disappeared as far as I know. They're gone. Meanwhile, back on Main Street at Walnut Street, under the regime of Bill Woods, who drank scotch, played excellent bridge, and was expert at investing the bank's money, they took over this Willard block and awarded Mr. John Hardy the task of demolition. They're always going to demolish things, you know. During the demolition phase, Bill Woods said he could look out his Main Street office window and he'd see a dear little old lady with blue hair rinse standing on the sidewalk across the street, across Main Street, watching the demolition. Day after day, there she was, looking more dejected all the time as the building came down a piece at a time. Eventually, in a moment of pity, somebody brought her into the bank during a rainstorm and introduced her to Bill Woods. Turned out the little old lady was Miss Mary Willard, granddaughter of Charles Willard, who's up there on the bank, up on the Federal Savings Building. And Miss Willard was grieving daily at the demise of the building at the hands of John Hardy, and she asked for one piece of memorabilia from the building. Yes, she wanted the statue of her grandfather. Turned out the contract with Mr. Hardy gave him possession of all the artifacts and all materials from the building, and he didn't want to give up Mr. Willard free will gratis to Miss Willard. So Mr. Willard was gently lowered to a horizontal position on a flatbed truck and taken to a place in Mr. Hardy's backyard, where he was again placed upright, facing southwest, still with 3 inches of pigeon poop on his shoulders. And Mr. Willard remained in Mr. Hardy's yard for a year or two, and while he advertised him. And in one day that'll live in infamy in Muncie, Mr. Willard was bought by a man who operated some kind of a tourist trap flea market drive-in place in the middle south of the United States of America, somewhere between here and Florida, as I understand it. And there again, Mr. Willard was erected facing southwest with a serious expression on his bronze face and a tear in each eye and about 1 inch of southern bird dew on each shoulder. This might have been the end of Mr. Willard's place in the hearts and minds and memories of the people of Muncie, but it wasn't. Mr. Ed Petty, God bless his memory, the former owner-manager of Ball Stores, bless its memory, decided that Mr. Willard should be brought back home. And Ed journeyed south to see and talk to Mr. Willard's owner. He reported, Ed said he saw Mr. Willard standing in a field of southern weeds with tears of homesickness streaming down his bronze face. Ed offered the owner some big bucks, but he failed to get Mr. Willard back. Won't someone help Mr. Willard to come home again? He could be put in Weiser Park with the Indian and the 2 stone ladies from the old courthouse. These 4 people faced each other in the courthouse square for 80 years or so. Shouldn't they be reunited? Then we could add Mr. McCullough, the half-naked Greek lady. Why not a statue of Monsieur Simon? He was said by historians to be the French fur trader. It was assigned to the Wapahani and Mississinawa rivers by the French trading companies. Why not a statue of Rebecca Hackley, granddaughter of Chief Little Turtle, who sold the land of Muncie to the white man? What about a statue of Goldsmith C. Gilbert? Another slide here, please. There's another view of the Willard block. Mr. Willard is now hidden behind the sign that says Muncie Federal. Next. And that became the bank drive-in. That's all that's left of that building that Mr. Willard's family put up. Next slide. There's Goldsmith C. Gilbert. We could have a statue of him. Guy in the middle at the top there. Pretty nice looking guy. Rebecca Hackley. And what about a statue of Mayor Dale? Next slide, please. That's Mayor Dale on the left. He was the first one that openly defied the Ku Klux Klan. He was also the first of our mayors to get a presidential pardon from prison. We could also have next slide, please. We do have one thing named after George R. Dale, the George R. Dale Dam right at McCullough Park. That's it right there. I've been over that in a canoe more than once. And we could have a statue of Front Porch Randall Harmon. And then we could have a statue of Babe Swartz, who operated Babe's Truck Stop, where the weary and lonely traveler could be serviced, and who bragged that she'd been arrested 17 times, but had never spent a night in jail. Why not statues of Jack Mann and Ron Bonham and Eric Jones and Jack Moore, our greatest local basketball players? And the statue of Big Jim Carrey, our most famous politician of any age. How about a fully clothed statue of Edmund F. Ball? That'd be nice. We could also have a statue of Dr. Arthur J. Finney. Arthur Finney, A.J. Finney, M.D., in the upper left corner. He mapped not only this area, that's Delaware County, but he mapped adjacent counties. He drew the first geologic map of Indiana. He mapped the Trenton oil and gas field that permitted the boom here. Arthur J. Finney. Next slide, please. There's Dr. Finney. Practiced medicine here. He was an amateur geologist, but his maps of the Trenton oil and gas field were considered remarkably accurate. and he told people when and where to drill and how deep to drill. We could have a statue of Emily Kimbrough, the most famous writer to ever lived in Muncie. We could have a statue of the late Garrett Phillips, Reverend Garrett Phillips, who always said he was here and he was glad. And we could have David Letterman and Jim Davis. And then what about a statue of Hurley Goodall? And then we could have a statue of Jerry Anderson. Why not a statue of Jerry Anderson? Or Jack Emmons, or Fergus Keir, or J. Roberts Daly. And maybe we should bring Cyrus Dahlean's statue of the passing of the buffalo and put it in Weiser Park. And maybe we should, next slide, maybe we should bring the Appeal to the Great Spirit by Cyrus Dahlean, bring it from Walnut Street and put it in Weiser Park. And there may be a lot of other hidden statuary around Muncie that should be moved to Weiser Park. Let's look at some of those. There's the Appeal to the Great Spirit again. Just keep moving through these rabbits. We could put Benny in that park, Weiser Park. Move her out of Ball State, put her in Weiser Park, be wonderful there. Next statue, please. There's a statue. There's a statue we could put there. We could take the word pets off of it and paint it a different color, you know. Next one, please. There's a statue. Big Jack up on North Broadway. Next one, please. These are all there's the John, what's the? Paul Bunyan, there. Anyway, we could bring him. Let's keep moving here. There's another statue we could put in Weiser Park. Just think of all the statuary we got in Muncie. Keep moving. Go through this rapidly. There's another beautiful statue we could put in Weiser Park. We could fill that park up with statues. Keep moving there. Just keep moving. Keep moving. Wonderful statues. That statue, the original, is in Spencer, Indiana, on the courthouse square, the doughboy from World War I. Keep moving. That's in Elm Ridge Cemetery. Elm Ridge Cemetery. Keep moving. There's a partially naked woman in Elm Ridge Cemetery. Keep moving. Elm Ridge. Keep moving. There's a next slide, please. Now that would be a good statue too, pointing. You know, that's the way I looked when I was young. One time, I can walk on water too. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are other statues that could be moved there. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Move through these very rapidly, please, very rapidly. This is the statue of the unknown Middletown citizen. I am not at liberty to tell you who this is, but this unknown Middletown citizen, if moved to Weiser Park, would be wonderful, I think. So, anyway, lights on now, please. So citizens of Muncie, I think we must awaken and see the dangers of impending demolition. I think we've got to circle the wagons. I think we shouldn't let unplanned obsolescence and urban demolition by starlings, fires, malfeasance, sloth, fast food facades, bulldozers destroy all of our roots. Our roots may seem small and unimportant, but they're our roots. Let's save at least some of this outdoor sculpture. Save the Weiser Arch. Some people are ready to tear it down. Save the Weiser Park. Bring Mr. Willard back home. To tell you the truth, I'm haunted by bulldozers. You know, Muncie's got its warts and moles. What town doesn't? But think of the features it has that are really positive. Muncie has one large and very successful business, property owner, employer institution called Ball State University, which has put us on many maps. Muncie has a good convention center and a soon-to-be great children's museum. We have a fine new city government building and a beautiful county government building. Muncie has several large, successful manufacturing plants, including ABB, Warner Gear, New Venture Gear, Delco Battery, the Ontario Group, dozens of busy smaller plants, especially some world-class tool and die shops. We also have the Minnetrista Cultural Center, which has blessed us with an amazing series of shows, dinosaurs to aircraft to painters. We have a first-class public radio station, which means we get some broadcasts which are other than pure 100% rock and roll. We have a television station that brings us fare other than commercial station sitcoms, which feature brain-damaged Hollywood types. How many cities, even large cities, have both morning and evening newspapers, which are excellent and successful? And we've been blessed with some first-class community and governmental leadership. We should be proud of our Hurley Goodall and our John Worthen, our John Pruce, our Jim Carey, David Dominic, Father and Son Services, Van Smith, John Fisher, Larry Shores, Jim Davis, Ed Ball, Russ Sloan, Ed Seward, Steve Anderson, Bill Skinner, Bill Peterson, Ferd Snodgrass. Nick Clark, Sam Abram, and Barbara Maves, Gene Drum, and Mary Sissel. Those are important people. Remember this, that we in Muncie withstood having David Letterman in our midst for 4 years and suffered no problems. On the other hand, in 15 years that Letterman has been in New York, it's gone down the tube a lot. And think of it, we're a freestanding, autonomous town. We're no big town's bedroom suburb. We have our own action, our own personality, our own chance to be anything we want to be. We're ourselves. We're a compact town. Everything is 5 or 10 minutes this way or that. None of those 30 to 50-minute commuter runs on overloaded freeways in Muncie. And our town is safe in most areas, maybe not perfect, but does anyone want to trade our streets with Detroit or LA or Washington or New York or Indianapolis? And our town isn't afflicted with smog or pollution. Our river runs clean thanks to John Craddock. We don't have earthquakes to mount to much. We don't have bad floods. We've never had hurricanes or landslides or beach erosion or forest fires or tidal waves. Some people say that Muncie is a good place to raise children. That's true, but it's also a good place to be an adult and make children and enjoy a comfortable lifestyle at any age. We may not be the imaginary Athens of the world, as is always spouted by Dave Werner, but Muncie is a decent place to live. And it's also a place, Muncie is very fortunate to have my community of Normal City for its neighbor. Remember that my Normal City is that charmed village on the west bank of the White River, made up of happy people, snug homes, and honest businesses caught in a time lock of yesteryear. So, John, if you'd pass those papers out, I think we should all do our bit for Muncie. And so I'm going to ask, we're going to pass out a pledge to Muncie, and we're all going to stand up and take the pledge. But you've got to get a copy of this first. This is the last thing I'm going to do, so withhold any applause that you had planned until I finish here. So he'll pass these out, and I hope it's legible. It's written in English. So let's have everybody stand up now, and we'll give this pledge to Muncie. Everybody got them? To this town of ours, to Muncie town, to Magic City, to the Queen City of the Gas Belt, to Middletown, to America's hometown, to this metropolis in the boondocks, to this tip town, to all of the sojourn here, to Ball State University, to Muncie. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. If you have any questions, read the book.
Thank you, Bill.